So as far as software, basically, and unfortunately this keeps evolving, but we tend to use online prediction software so as to try to understand, once we have a date in mind, approximately where things will fly. This will vary a lot depending on where you are in the country and whether or not you can possibly get into certain areas. I generally say here in Minnesota, if you find a place that uh, doesn't have lots of trees, that's good, and doesn't have lots of open water, that's good. But even if it's missing both and doesn't have lots of roads, that's bad. And the reason that's bad is because that probably means that the place is unsuitable for roads, and hence like swamps and stuff, which don't show up as trees or open water. So yes, we've used, I guess it's probably called SondHub these days, but basically that's a replacement to something that was called uh, uh, C, CUSF, which has gone away in the recent months, unfortunately, for doing predictions. It turns out that these predicting software packages, for the most part, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, tend not to have a lot of input parameters. So you say when you're going to launch and where and how high it will go and how fast it will go up, but nothing like, and how long will it float at that altitude. And so in that case, we have to work a bit harder and possibly write our own software or use software that's been developed by other teams that's not commercially available, but would be available among teams in the NEBP, as we just share with each other, for things like float, which basically will modify the predictions from a basic flight. On the other hand, it's possible to use a basic flight predictor and say, okay, if you go up that high and burst, well, if you pretend to go up higher, that's almost as if you're floating, because once you get really high, you tend not to move that much anyway. And so we can use basic predictors to estimate what would happen even in a floated flight. But that takes some experience and a little bit of good luck as well.
Christian.
Yeah, so for me, as far as software and planning tools, we start off looking at weather to try to pick up a flight date. So I like to go to National Weather Service. You can use whatever weather program you want, but they tend to all pull from that same data set. And I'll look at surface winds on the day of launch and just weather conditions, like we don't want to launch in rain or thunderstorms or things like that. So that'll help me dial in on a day. And then the second piece of weather prediction software I like to use is Windy. So I go to windy.com. And that's not going to give us the whole flight, but it goes up to about, I think it's 45,000 feet. And I can get wind predictions at altitude. And that's going to determine, for us, how far east we go. Essentially, you're looking at the jet stream and how far it's going to push you. Because we don't want to drive really. We drive typically about 100 miles each direction from launch to recovery and back. So we don't want to go much further than that if we can help it. So winds are a big deal. Our weather tends to be pretty good and consistent in the summertime. So it's really wind more than anything else that we're looking at. And then just as James said, we use flight prediction software. I generally use a web-based predictor just to try to hone in on a flight day. So we also try to target recovery zones that are going to be accessible. So, we're surrounded here by mountains, so we don't want to land in mountains. We're trying to find open rangeland. And the same thing, we want roads and accessibility, private landowners that are generally pretty friendly with us. And we launch from airports generally, just because we do FAA coordination on our flights, and it's easier to just use an airport. Plus, they're big, wide open spaces. They work pretty decent. So the weather is going to determine which airport we launch from, because we have a target area that we're aiming for. And then for the flight prediction software, there's also a downloadable version, actually just called Balloon Prediction. I'm using version 0.9.7.8, and I believe you can download that still from the National Weather Service website. So that's a standalone app. And we'll use that for burst prediction. And then, as James was alluding to, for float predictions, you can trick the software and tell it that, essentially that you're just not going to be ascending or descending for a certain chunk of airspace. And it'll figure out your float prediction. But generally, that comes with experience. We look at past flight paths. So if we're flying repeatedly and we're hitting a predictable altitude, we have a general idea of the direction that we're going to drift, particularly up at the high altitudes. And I've used that for landing predictions, and that seems to work well. But you need data points to look back at to be able to figure that out.